On today's episode of Too Late Who Gives a Shit, I'll be talking about like a 3-month-old game. The Last of Us 2 has been a development mired by controversy, politics, and plenty of that delicious drama that the internet craves. The original has been regarded as either a masterpiece by some or a linear non-game by others. Regardless of your stance on the series, I firmly believe The Last of Us to be a very polished and carefully developed series, in spite of some of the political views of the creator, Neil Druckmann, as well as some of the other cast members. I try not to shove my own political views into my videos, as I ultimately believe it doesn't add anything and only serves to push people away. But for what it's worth, I'll declare up front that I'm a liberal who doesn't get along with pretty much any other liberal and values complete, unequivocal freedom of speech above essentially everything. My political stance is about as meaningless as my existence on this planet as a video game reviewer, so if you hear me spout a viewpoint commonly attributed to the anti-SJWs or defend trans people like an SJW would, then please appreciate the fact that I form my own opinions on hot-button issues by adopting stances from both sides of the aisle, and if you try to pigeonhole me as being exclusively left or right, you're always going to be wrong. Thanks.
Fuck it.
I was a big fan of the original game, and I even edited together a lengthy video paying tribute to the soundtrack composed by Gustavo Santaolalla, which actually dictated the final product by basing the game around his compositions. The gameplay was fun, the characters were well realized, the story was interesting and tense, and the world as a whole was a really interesting mixture of tranquil nature scenes with gritty survival horror, with an emphasis on resource management and stealth, with plenty of that beautiful character drama that keeps the stakes high, which are all things I enjoy in a zombie game. People levied fair criticisms against the game in reference to the linear nature of some of the areas and the dependency on scripted scenes to add conflict and drama. But as an entire experience, I came away feeling deeply touched and impressed, thanks in no small part to the cast giving some extremely believable and organic performances. When I heard The Last of Us 2 was coming out, I was pleased and decided to wait patiently despite not being that excited for it. I saw as more and more teaser cinematics came out and realized most of them pertained to Ellie and Abby more than they did Joel. And for a while, the trailers looked like some art house piece designed to flaunt how realistically the technology would portray real-world violence and gore. But over time, I stopped being excited and simply waited to hear more concrete news before moving on with my life. Eventually, news came forward that a disgruntled former employee supposedly leaked plot details amidst unsustainable working conditions and crunch culture, and the internet collectively decided that we would all unanimously band against Naughty Dog and boycott the game. The social justice side of the coin would do it for creative and righteous reasons of supporting the workers and dismantling the corrupt video games industry that preys upon the high turnover rate of artists and programmers. And the anti-social justice side would do it for supposedly empowering an evil, allegedly transgender character and besmirching their favorite characters in a disrespectful way, while also being able to dunk on the main antagonist and get some edgy potshots in there. I don't really take that sort of thing too seriously, as I mainly ascribe it to people being fed up with censor-happy online activists doing everything they can to spite the Caucasian gaming populace and laugh at them every step of the way. So when gamers can find the opportunity to bait hypersensitive ideologues knowing they'll get a meme-worthy response, I know there's generally a difference between people doing that versus holding genuinely bigoted ideals. But even if you disagree with me, I'm just some internet reviewer with zero power or influence in that department, so you can just disregard my opinion if you think I'm a terrible person, and that's completely fine. But much like with the Pokemon Sword and Shield situation, I tend to view both extremes of any side as being equally obnoxious, and try to see things from a middle ground. The opening hours of the game are largely slow, and paint the game as being more narrative-centric than the original game, which made it a slog to play through initially as well as on subsequent attempts, even when compared to the opening hours of the first game. The cast is largely uninteresting and forgettable, thanks largely to the fact that there are way more characters to remember this time around, and none of them get any time to flesh out their backstory save for Abby and, to some extent, Owen. Ellie's bisexual girlfriend Dina has the characterization of a plank of wood, and Dina's ex-boyfriend Jesse similarly checks the box of Asian guy and doesn't have any real personality or backstory to speak of. The writers attempt to build characterization by having the cast constantly poking and prodding at each other, despite the audience never learning anything substantive about them. I know it's generally accurate to make young people be mean to each other in a dry humor fashion, but as an adult knowing the script was written by adults for actors to read while playing the role of young adults, something about it makes me feel secondhand embarrassment. We eventually find out Dina is pregnant with Jesse's child, which introduces a conflict that later gets used as a way to introduce tension, but otherwise the story is pretty much entirely about Ellie avenging Joel's death with some setbacks and diversions here and there, to pad out the game for 20 plus hours until the final showdown. The characters are largely passable, and the writers do a decent job of making them feel like real people, thanks in no small part to the talent doing very well in terms of bringing them to life, with Ellie being hit or miss and being written as a fully realized lesbian who, despite having aged from 14 to 19, apparently went through some sort of feminine puberty that makes her voice sound significantly deeper. I really enjoyed Ashley Johnson's portrayal of Ellie in the original game, and found her to be a really believable character, but for some reason her direction in this game felt sort of mixed. Like at times she sounded completely normal like she did at age 14 in the original game, and at others it sounded like they tried to make her extra tomboy as she deepened her voice naturally, and she would occasionally bounce between the two extremes. I can't be the only one who thought it sounded different, can I?
I had so many questions for them. Why did you pull me out of there while I was still unconscious?
Like, at least just wait for Jessie to rest up.
She could be gone by then.
Ellie.
We know her location. Maybe Tommy does too. Yeah, well, they did beat the shit out of us. The one guy, Jordan, kicked my face in.
Yeah, but why do you think that they didn't finish the—
It doesn't matter. They fucked up.
I don't know Abby nor care about her, despite the game forcing you to play as her and seeing the situation from her perspective. And initially I thought Abby's Neanderthalian face was really annoying to look at throughout the game, but the more time I spent playing it, the less it bothered me, partly because the game took the opportunity to show her smiling and having positive interactions with other characters after initially being led to believe that she would be a genuinely evil piece of shit from start to finish. It also doesn't help that I dated a tomboyish, muscular girl in college, and the aesthetic of a slimmer, less muscular Abby reminded me of an ex-girlfriend of whom I had good memories. She may not be the archetypal badass woman or super seductive female lead that people have come to expect of modern video game females, but I thought she was, at the very least, memorable, even if the decision she makes brings her intelligence into question. My favorite parts of the game definitely had to be any flashback sequences with Joel, not only because they were faithful to the original characters in the first game, but after the painful loss of realizing Joel wasn't going to be present in 90% of the game after his death, I was surprisingly warmed by his subsequent appearances. I was bitter and confident that I would hate Abby, and here the story was toying with my expectations and making me feel all sorts of emotional confusion. I wanted to spend as much time as possible with Joel, but I was so saddened by what they did to my boy that I was desperate to squeeze as much time as possible with my late cowboy dad out of this full-priced game. It reminded me that Joel really is a pathetic, lonely old man who's searching for a sense of meaning and experiences some semblance of remorse after saving Ellie from the Fireflies against her will. He clearly fights to protect her, and she goes through her teenager phase of resisting and sassing him constantly, but he keeps trying because he loves her, which really makes the foresight of his fate all the more bittersweet. A lot of people have already discussed what makes the character writing inconsistent in The Last of Us 2, so I won't dwell on it extensively, and Matthew Matosis already made a fantastic review summarizing his thoughts on the writing and gameplay difficulty, but I'll touch on some things I found interesting because I bought the fucking game and goddamn it, I'll at least break even. Abby losing her father makes perfect sense as the origin of a good revenge story, but the way she's characterized initially will always lead the player to resent her based on her being a completely new character killing the protagonist from the first game, as anyone still bitter about Metal Gear Solid 2 in the current year will tell you that Raiden's bait and switch made them feel cheated and angry, although even that game did much more to elevate Snake by using Raiden's inadequacies to really put the legendary soldier on a pedestal. The game essentially makes the player look at Joel's character through the lens of someone who was directly harmed by him and effectively had their life and the world ruined, and for some they might see this and think, yeah, she's right to be angry, and yeah, if I were in her shoes I might do the same thing. Let me be clear when I express that I love Joel in spite of his shortcomings. He was clearly a very grizzled and battle-weary old guy who lost his entire family, save for his brother. And when the first game's text in the prologue pops up and says 15 years later, we're only getting the general gist of just how much personal agony and hell he's been through. We only have our imaginations to use in picturing just how harrowing his life has been since losing Sarah. I don't think anyone genuinely believes Joel is a good person at his very core, since moments after escaping a perilous bandit trap, he himself admitted to using the same tactics on innocent people in the past to get by, much to Ellie's shock.
How did you know?
Know what?
About the ambush.
I've been on both sides.
We'll take that as a yes.
Take it however you want.
The concept that Joel would eventually get his comeuppance came as no surprise to me personally. When I heard that The Last of Us 2 was being announced and I didn't see Joel in the trailers, I figured he died in some way. But the optimist in me assumed he would die sometime after the midpoint in the story, not right at the fucking beginning. While I disagreed with the writing and feel like it could have been done much better, I acknowledge that they killed Joel off in the very beginning in order to ignite the revenge plot. But in doing so, they took a man who was previously extremely combative and emotionally calloused after having been seen assaulting people he doesn't know under the wise assumption that everyone is a survivor scrounging for any and all supplies, no matter the cost, and made him the antithesis of that. When Joel and Tommy go to ridiculous lengths to save Abby from a horde of infected during an incredibly heavy snowstorm, only to walk in completely casually with his guard down and introduce himself, it goes against everything that had previously established his character in the first game. Then we see Abby blow off his legs with a shotgun, order one of her partners to stop the bleeding so he doesn't die too quickly, before she bludgeons him to death with a nearby golf club anyway. The player is given control of Ellie, who follows the sounds of him screaming and attempts to rescue him before being pinned down and forced to watch Joel's bloated, swollen face as Abby lands the final hit, afterwards showing one of the wolves spitting on Joel's corpse. This is all excessively geared towards angering the player, and for many it was too far, and made them settle into the mindset that Abby and the wolves were savages who could not be redeemed under any circumstances. The game attempts to make you feel like a monster as you're forced to kill a pregnant woman, murder multiple dogs who are hunting you down with their owners and kill the owners as well, along with generally doing things that would make perfect sense in a revenge story. I likely wasn't as upset by the writing because 1, I read up on the leaks and had time to process my grief and rage at the decision to kill off Joel, and 2, zombie apocalypse stories seldom conclude on a positive, everyone lived happily ever after note, seeing as the literal world has ended. If you had asked me prior to the leaks what would happen to Joel and Ellie in the game, I would have told you that Ellie would probably survive and Joel likely would die by the end of the game, seeing as he already had time to tell his story and the game would try to immortalize him as one of the best zombie apocalypse characters in history with a sacrificial death, even if that would have been a predictable and cliched guess. The point is, I was fully prepared for Joel to die implicitly because of the nature of the narrative genre, and it would have been more of a surprise for him to continue living and have everyone turn out just fine despite the extremely dangerous setting of the series. But I was definitely upset that he died right off the bat for the sake of the revenge story, because I would have told you way earlier that you would have at least had him in your party for like a few hours. There were some details that kind of confused me, like the GameStop marketing email for The Last of Us 2, saying that killing the dogs was supposed to make their beloved owner scream out in anguish, but this never happened to me a single time, and I killed like 5 dogs. Every single time I did it, they would just remark that the enemy was coming from my direction. They didn't really seem to care about their dogs at all. Naturally, I cared a decent bit as a warm-blooded human that loves animals, and this was made extra impactful when you played as Abby later in the game and got to interact with these same dogs pre-euthanasia and saw how adorable and lifelike their motion capture was, even though it was a blatantly manipulative decision. The scene where Abby and Yara are throwing a ball and the dog keeps bringing it back to both of them genuinely made me smile. Also, the enemies who shout out their teammates' names whenever they die never made me feel like a cold-blooded killer who was slaying people with loved ones and supposedly heartbeats. It just sounded like they realized their friend died and were just announcing it, rather than giving it the burst of traumatic emotion that would have really made the player feel an extreme sense of guilt. This made much more sense once you realize the bulk of the voice actors in this game primarily had experience in anime voiceover, which isn't to say they can't act, but they can't act. Record less visual novels and more live-action work, and maybe you'll have the talent to emotionally move me next time, idiot. The combat in the original game was certainly nothing spectacular, but it always felt solid for what it was trying to do. It pretty much embodied the experience of struggling to survive in a post-apocalyptic zombie wasteland, scavenging for supplies and utilizing old and unmaintained weapons that barely serve their purpose. In the new game, it feels a bit more fleshed out thanks to the dodge and counter system that also makes it a bit easier to fight clickers and get out of difficult situations in a pinch. But it really irritated me how you basically had to dodge and counter systematically in order to survive, as attempting to wail on the melee button to take down the enemy quickly was always interrupted by the enemy's flailing arms. Like, look at these enemies in half speed and you'll see what I mean. They sort of just reach their arms up and outward like the combat engine is priming their limbs for a quick strike at any given moment. It made the whole thing feel slippery and comedic. The human enemies were undeniably fun to fight, and despite them remaining mostly identical compared to the first game, they definitely feel more intelligent and organized this time around. Killing infected is still fun, but there's definitely something so addicting about outsmarting enemy AI as they secretly collude to flank you. I also thought the stalkers were well utilized and were probably the only aspect of the game to remind me that I'm playing a survival horror game instead of just a zombie-themed action game, as I'd hear them shriek out of sight and peeking around corners expecting to see one charging me, to the point where I wish I encountered them more often. The Rat King fight was kind of interesting as it mostly just had me throwing as much damage at him as quickly as possible without letting him get too close. And I enjoyed seeing them split into two, only to realize the smaller one was a separate stalker mini-boss on its own. The gun upgrades were undeniably satisfying, as adding more stability, a scope, a stock, a muzzle to the front of your gun, etc. shows the character grabbing a bunch of doodads and tools and augmenting their hardware with dauntless confidence, making it audio-visual gun porn for those of us who enjoy accurate gunplay and realistic mechanisms being reflected in a digital simulation. I thought the stealth gameplay was neat, as being able to go prone in the grass made for a very nice predatory playstyle reminiscent of Metal Gear Solid 3. I like the ability to add a suppressor to your handgun using a soda bottle, despite that making literally zero fucking sense. I thought it was kind of annoying that you could only place explosives instead of throwing them like you could in the original game, since 90% of the time I'd underestimate the device's range, and this would subsequently happen. Being able to craft ammo was really useful and made the hunting pistol extremely overpowered at all times, although I always had an excess of paper that I could never pick up because I almost never needed to heal. Once I played the game again on Normal Plus, however, I found that I was consistently starved of resources and always short on first aid kits, despite playing even more conservatively compared to my first playthrough. So I'm interested in seeing what the game will be like on hard and above. Regardless of your opinion of the half-assed story and emotionally manipulative character development, I think we can all agree that the locales you explore and the terrain you fight enemies in are really enjoyable, and the gameplay feels tighter than ever thanks to some new mechanics and movement options. It makes me wish I just had a base defense arcade mode or an enemy rush mode where I can forego all of the lofty symbolic cutscenes and just kill some cunts. And it goes without saying a multiplayer mode would be nice considering the first game had one, and then they took it out of this game and vaguely hinted that they'd be doing something much bigger than a simple multiplayer mode? Sure, I guess. At least I got a physical copy so I can get like $5 back. I found the motion capture to be particularly satisfying on the basis that slicing an enemy's throat or killing them by snapping their neck will elicit a very strained expression on Abby and Ellie's faces. It's nothing amazing, but it really made me realize just how far video game motion capture has come, especially since the facial expressions in the first game look quite dated in comparison. The guitar playing feature was cute, but every time I'd swipe on my PS4 controller's touchpad, it seemed like I was either hitting every string or missing a few, despite never doing it any differently. The music was unfortunately pretty starkly different compared to the original game, which had a lot of acoustic tracks and very peaceful, hopeless compositions. The sequel features primarily electronic music, and despite Gustavo Santaolalla being listed as the sole composer, I refuse to believe that a guy who specializes in string instruments suddenly picked up Cubase and went at it with a bunch of dramatic electronic tracks. It's fine for tense battle segments when you don't really need to focus on it, but it's absolutely nothing noteworthy, and unfortunately I won't be making a musical analysis for it like I did for the first game. Overall, the game was a good time. I can see why people dislike the general plot and the new characters introduced and all that, and I agree with them for the most part, but as a general product, I had a really good time. It looked good, it sounded good, it played great, and there were a ton of really well executed visuals to distinguish it from the first game, which looks somehow primitive now in comparison. I don't blame people for being upset about the story's premise and all of the flawed character writing because they're 100% right to be irritated. These weren't things that should have been arranged the way that they were, but I was likely able to look past them to a certain degree because I was an immense fan of the first game, and I was going to enjoy this game no matter what, even if they killed off everyone's favorite character to kick off a revenge story. I bought the game expecting to be able to stalk enemies from the tall grass and stab dudes in the throat, and I got exactly what I was looking for. But unfortunately, it had a bunch of unremarkable characters and brain-dead plot beats in order to move the story along. So yeah, there you go, those are my thoughts. Please send me money and/or watch this video repeatedly so I can drum up enough money to recover from this financial sinkhole. Thanks.